the public are absolutely entitled to be angry, frustrated, hurt and disappointed. But we have to understand that in a free market, companies that rip off their customers, that lie to the regulators, don't survive, they're not sustainable. ASIC has 6,000 pages of laws that it is administering. If we are going to have a Royal Commission, we should focus on the underlying root causes. And from my perspective, it's about the government. We now have banks and wealth management companies that are basically guaranteed profits by the government through compulsory superannuation. We have a government guarantee that means banks can't fail. We have the so-called 4 pillars policy, which means bad banks can't be taken over. From my perspective, we have a Soviet-like system of financial wealth advisory services, and this is not surprising. If we are going to empower customers, then we need a system whereby we understand our own superannuation, and I would argue not many Australians do. We need companies that are more focused on customers and their clients rather than focused on gaming the system, that is the government. We need a cultural change at the very highest level of companies because we have seen massive corporate failures of lying, exactly as Andrew said, customers being charged for services they haven't been served. So this has to be a much bigger discussion about financial services and about us as customers. And for me, the focus has to be as much on the failure of government as it is on failure of boards.
Very briefly, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott said today that the regulators should all be sacked. But the thing that worries him most is at the end of the Royal Commission, there'll be new regulations on the banks. Do you agree with him?
I think that is a very real problem. We can have more regulation, but it's not as if the financial sector is unregulated. There are regulations against this outrageous, unlawful activity that we've seen.
They don't seem to have worked, though, John.
Well, I would argue ASIC has absolutely failed. ASIC doesn't need more rules and regulations and staff. ASIC needs, for example, as one of the 4 major regulators of the sector, to enforce the law. You can have all the laws you want against unlawful behaviour, but if from the very top of the board there is not a culture of respect for customers, respect for clients, we are going to get this sort of behaviour. And we have to understand that the bank sector, we all, by and large, have a share in it. Exactly as Andrew said, the bank sector is important to the success of the Australian economy. And one of the reasons the IPA opposed the Royal Commission is because we're going to have a discussion.
Support it now?
Still no. I mean, it's a question of compliance. Is because we have these issues rather than focusing on government failure and the fact that to some extent this is almost going to be expected to happen. I think from my perspective it's wonderful, and it's one of the great strengths of Australia, that by and large most of us think we are middle class or working class. I think that goes to cohesion, it goes to a sense of community. There probably are 6 classes, there's probably hundreds of classes. I for one don't like the term class because it implies we're stuck. For me, it's about mobility, it's about empowerment. For me, from an IPA perspective, the biggest class difference is between those who have the dignity of work and those who don't. I think there is an emerging difference in the community, as Rebecca talks about, which goes not to income but goes to belief, goes to values, it goes to attitudes about education, about family, about religion, about community participation. For me, one of the biggest concerns is the growing gap between, as I said, those in work, those out of work, children in jobless households. That, whether you call it a class divide or something else, that for me, that division in society, I think is very worrying. I'm less concerned about smashed avocado versus kale and more concerned about, do you have the dignity of work and do you have the capacity to get out of your current situation if it's difficult and improve yourself? Duncan asked a really key question a few years ago. Tonight he asked a key question, but he's participating in the public debate and good on him. And if one participates in the public debate, there is a background to what you say. It does concern me that sometimes we listen to where people are coming from and them as an individual rather than what they're saying. But I fully support what Duncan's participation.
Can I just make the point, because one of the things he's communicated to us is that he's spoken to friends of his who try to encourage other people to speak out, and they're all terrified of doing it because in their past there are things that they don't want splashed all over the front page of a tabloid newspaper in Melbourne, which is what happened to him.
Oh, look, and we've all made mistakes and everyone deserves a second go. But Duncan and his friends should absolutely be entitled to participate, but their participation comes in a context.
With a price.
Well, I'm not sure it's a price.
Well, it was for him.
It's a context that we engage in a debate, and good on Duncan for participating. Oh, look, I think it is a challenge to egalitarianism, and at the same time, while I don't like the idea of class, I do think there is a political class in Australia, and I think the political class is by and large made up of baby boomers who have had a wonderful few generations that many of us are now going to be paying for, and it goes to housing affordability, it goes to a debate about immigration levels. It goes to a debate about transport.
So you're actually arguing that the politicians in power are too selfish, essentially, to change the taxation arrangements that make housing so profitable for some and so unaffordable for others?
Sometimes, yes. I think Andrew and I would disagree on whether you should tax something to get more of it. But I would argue that in many cases the politicians are oblivious to exactly as we've heard this potential generational divide, which is a class difference.
Okay,
I would disagree with Andrew's views on inequality. There are different measures of inequality. To some extent, inequality is a measure of freedom. It is a measure of the choices we make. If Bill Gates moves to Australia right now, Australia is a more unequal society. So there are different measures of inequality, and I disagree.
Inequality makes you free. You could actually make a slogan out of that.
Working hard makes you free too.
All right.
But the question relates to stagnant wage growth, which is a real issue. It relates to declining productivity. It relates to the fact that workers have not seen much of an increase in their real income. But it goes to many different factors. It goes to red tape. It goes to the government regulation we've been talking about. The reason the gig economy in Australia is growing, I would argue, is precisely because it isn't unionised. So Australia has many challenges. I listen to Sally McManus and my heart breaks when she talks about increasing the minimum wage by $50. That is going to put hundreds of thousands of young people out of work. The unions are now debating the wrong issues. We have to be debating how we can manage many careers, many levels of education, many different jobs. Seriously, to Marcus's question, I don't believe the government should own a media outlet. I believe in a free press, and I love the ABC. My family have grown up on the ABC. The ABC...
It's a corporation. The government doesn't own it in the sense that you're talking about. It's not a government-owned entity in that regard.
We can split straws, Tony, on what the government's role is on the ABC. But at a serious point, I think that the $1 billion that the ABC gets, which by and large is often well spent, sometimes I would argue it isn't well spent, can be given back to the people for them to decide whether the ABC should be supported or not.